Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Good to have you back again. And Merry Christmas to you. And Mike, Merry Christmas to you as well. I got everything I liked, which is just half-price books. We have a half-price books chain out here in the Midwest. I think it's down south as well. Do you have them out there in the Boston area? Half-price books?
We do, especially in downtown Boston, but it's kind of like once you have to drive into the city, you're basically paying the other half with parking.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's my Christmas and birthday presents every year is just get a ton of half-price books because they have a great theology department and Bible or a Bible section and history and all that stuff. So I that's what I do. But yeah, Merry Christmas. You know, I want to begin today by just reflecting on where my mind went this Christmas. You know, every Christmas you try to think of something that is, as I've made some devotionals for different groups and things, you like to approach the holiday with some uniqueness, though it gets difficult after six decades, you know, for me. But this year was interesting in the sense that as I pursued a line of thought, I'd like to run it by you. I know that we often think of looking into the manger as a rescue operation, right? God came through Christ to rescue the human race. When I went looking through Paul and the epistles for rescue themes, I was surprised how little that really plays out, and more as a operation, or shall we say, looking into the manger and seeing revelation. So a story of revelation more than a story of rescue. I'm not going to turn for time, of course, to the passages, but let me just throw some at you because, again, they started to multiply as I looked at them. And like Hebrews 1, God has spoken to us in times past by the prophets and so forth, but now he has spoken to us by his Son, right? As though God is saying to himself, and I don't want to over-anthropomorphize God, but for the sake of the argument, it's as though God is saying to himself, boy, I've shown my people and the world who I am in so many ways. Let's see, is there another way I can show them who I am? And oh yes, my Son. In 2 Peter 1:4, that famous verse, that all things are given to us, and the becoming partakers of theosis or nature. Theos, divinization or apotheosis, and that idea. That notice there in that storyline that Jesus enters the world to bring us to himself in the divine world, that we somehow, and this is an amazing thing, I don't have, all the ins and outs on this, and I don't think anybody does, how we as humans turn into some kind of divine status, right? So it's less about sin there and more about the movement from human to divine or something like that. First, or Colossians 1, all things are summed up in Christ, the firstborn of creation. Again, less emphasis on sin there and more on the purpose of creation. Here it is in Jesus himself. 1 Corinthians 15, when you look at that text, again, noticing how Paul is playing out the purpose of Christ at the beginning of 15. He died for our sins, then he rose, he ascended, and now he is at the right hand of the Father, and you have that movement going on. But again, notice there, it's less about sin as you move through that text and more about overcoming death, and that death itself will be the last enemy to be solved through the coming of Jesus. So again, the emphasis more on revelation than on sin. Romans 15, in fact, I'll read that one. So again, become one of my favorite passages for its clarity. Now I say that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers. So a Jew can say, yes, God has kept his promise. And that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. So a Gentile saying, boy, God, you're merciful to me. Of course, that gets into that, like the Samaritan woman in John 4, being allowed to talk to the Messiah as though she has entrance to God the Father through this man without having to go through a proselytism to Judaism, something like that. I think that's again where this mercy is being shown to the Gentile. And then John 1, as we, again, are in John now. We're turning, by the way, in this episode to John 9, the man born blind. And my favorite verse of John so far, and still is John 1:18. No one has seen God at any time, seems to explain the inability of a human eye to have photons bounce off the back of the retina and comprehend who Yahweh is. It's just not how it works. And yet he says in that verse that a unique deity was in the kolpos, or the lap or the chest of the Father, and he has declared him to us, the human race. There again, the emphasis being on revelation, as though God is again saying, boy, how can I tell the world exactly who I am, what I'm like, what I think, how I react, what I think about my own people, and so forth. And that's the revelation, or that's the statement in John 1:18. So, as I've looked over the Christmas story this time around, again every year, it's fun to replay it. I've been surprised by the revelation, or the manger as revelation theme, more than, and not again that we have to get rid of the sin problem at all, but I'm saying that more than just Jesus being a rescue operation, he came to reveal the Father to us. So that's been a blessing for me. Any thoughts there before we jump into John 9?
I mean, I think that's part of the greater part of the whole narrative that we've been reading about and talking about. And I mean, it's even kind of touching upon what I was preaching on yesterday at my church. We were talking about the Magi. We've been going through a series where we were looking at just the first 2 chapters of Matthew, and just already, just even for a 3.5 week series, I say half because I think next week my pastor's only going to be preaching like a really short sermon because it's like right before Christmas. But just even the first 2 chapters are just jam packed with like just the fact that God will invite all kinds of people, no matter the mess that there's in their lives individually. Like the genealogy of Christ is just full of messes everywhere in there. And one of the things that I mentioned yesterday, and it was touching on another sermon from one of our pastors the week before, which was Joseph was called righteous. And at the end of that passage about Joseph, the realization is that he really did show that he was a righteous guy, not because of what he did, but because he was actually allegiant. He was loyally obeying what he received from the dream, even though it made no sense of why should I stay married to this woman? She is pregnant before we even actually consummated the marriage, and yet I'm supposed to take care of this child. And just because he received the dream from the angel, yes, he will do it. He'll protect the mother. He'll protect the child. And yesterday I mentioned to my church, guys, have you ever realized that Joseph never tasted the wine that Jesus made at the wedding in Cana? He never saw his son give the Sermon on the Mount, and he never heard the chants from the crowd, Hosanna to the Son of David.
I thought you were going to say the chants, crucify him, but you're right. He didn't hear either one. Yeah.
No, and that yet he did all that he did for probably 3 decades of Jesus's life to protect him, to raise him, to care and love him. And it was all because he was obedient. He was allegiant to the God of Israel. And so, yeah, we just went into just like then about the Magi, but I won't go into that. But it was just
Let's do that next time, by the way. The Magi would be an interesting DCW topic. Just a very, 5-minute introduction for our next podcast, because I do find that story screaming DCW issues. So. Oh,
yeah, it was everywhere. I mentioned Mike and also just some of the other stuff going on. But I was convinced at the end they became part of God's family, even though their understanding or what was revealed to them was very limited. But everyone starts somewhere. and that what I think was enough.
How true. And we're getting into that with John 9. That's a talk about a guy who has very little to go by. All of a sudden he meets the Son of Man. So let's do it. John chapter 9. Let's just jump in. Verse 1. Now as Jesus passed by, He saw a man who was blind from birth. Now, by the way, my guess we're in Judea. I should have checked there. We are around the temple area. Last I know, they were using the Mount of Olives in chapter 8. That was the woman taken in adultery. From what we know, he is near the temple area. I don't know if it says it. I'm sorry, the last verse of 8. Yes, he went out of the temple. So he is in the temple courtyards, again, a vast, like 14-acre plot of ground that is dedicated to Jews and Gentiles, God-fearing Gentiles, to come and talk about Yahweh. This is his home. This is the temple of Yahweh. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned? First question on their mind, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? We've got to talk about that quick. The cause of blindness in the ancient world and how they equated blindness and physical deformity of any kind really with sin. It seems to be the point of the story as we jump in. And let me read a little bit. This is from let me get the title here. How come I don't see my title? There it is. No, I took it off. It's the Theological Word Book or Theological Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. I know that's what it is, but for some reason I took off the title on my slide. In antiquity, disease was thought commonly to be demonic in origin. In many rituals, this is halfway through the article on the Hebrew word chala, to become weak, tired, ill, or feel pain. In antiquity, disease was thought commonly to be demonic in origin, and many rituals were devised by priests to combat the activities of demons and evil spirits that were credited with bringing afflictions. This is the ancient world in general. This is not Israel yet. The religious rituals were sometimes supplemented by the use of herbs and empirical medicines. Alone in the ancient Near East, the Hebrews, now think of how Jews thought, repudiated the demonic concept of disease origins. They adhered to Mosaic teachings, which ascribed sickness and health alike to the activities of the one true God. And he references Deuteronomy 32:39 and Isaiah 45:7, that God is the author of good and evil, or Tov and Ra. I would recommend that when we hear those kind of lines, they adhered to the Mosaic teachings. That's not all of Israel. That's certainly not all of the sects within Judaism, but generally, this is a very general statement that Judaism had Torah to go by, and Torah does not allow for a straight one-to-one correspondence between disease and demonic activity. A lot of the worlds around Israel thought that way. But his point in this article is that no, Israel had more clear teaching from Torah. Let me just finish this up. Moreover, sickness and health were directly related in the Jewish mind to God's curse and blessing. For example, God threatened disease as a punishment for covenant violations. I will bring upon you sudden terror, and so forth. That's from Deuteronomy 28. If you ... In other words, if you do not follow the Lord's will, you may be the target of my afflictions upon you. So God is still the one doing this, not demons. For example, he gives one other example. God threatened disease as a punishment for covenant violations. I will bring upon you, well, that's the same line, sudden terror and fever that will destroy you. So, there is my title. Yeah, the NIDOTTE, Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. And the point being, and I'm not going to read more of it here that's on the screen for those that want to read it, there's a huge difference between how the ancient world thought of disease and how Jews were supposed to think about disease. What surprises us in John 9 is that these leaders, well, it's the people. I guess you have to admit going in, it's the people who say this, not the leadership of Israel per se, who sinned. His disciples, in fact, Jesus' own disciples, who I think are rather run-of-the-mill theologians, at least starting up in their time with Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So they were presuming some kind of sin is the cause of this problem, which is not uncommon today. Still, people have this sense that karma will come behind you and knock you down if you are not a good person. But this is how they thought in that world, and it's just surprising that when Jesus comes upon this man, that's the first thing put out by the writer John, coming from the audience. So, for time, let me. Again, if someone would like to be watching on our video feed, I have more discussion about the cause of blindness and, again, pain and disease in that world. It's pretty, what's the word I want here? Complex as far as their way of thinking, that not as though it's magic, but is kind of like a karma idea, that coming behind evil in general must be bad actions. I wasn't far from that growing up, even as a Christian. In my my background, I used to pray that the Vikings would win on Sunday as a kid, and I realized, well, the other team has Christians praying for it. So now I kind of had this, well, if I'm a good kid for 6 days of the week, God will answer my prayer more than the fan of my, of the other team. That is a rendition, of this kind of idea that good happens to good people and bad happens to bad people. So I think we all have that, maybe in the back of our heads, we have that concept. But what Jesus says next is really the stunning thing. And that is, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God could be or should be revealed in him. Imagine being this man, overhearing that I am blind so that God could be revealed.
Ron,
it's a stunning idea. So,
can I I interject right here at this moment? It's kind of funny because, like, I mean, growing up as well, I've heard this type of theological thing. This is more like a folk religion belief, right? Because this is, like you said, the apostles, the disciples, were not displaying the best of theology. They were essentially just showing very common theological stances. But I remember once teaching, this was back in my 20s, once mentioning this passage. I'm just reading this passage and just talking about what Jesus said here, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. And I actually encountered a response from the other side of this, that this opposition of, so you're saying that God would actually send sickness for his own glory? And the person that was saying it, of course, was saying it with a lot of indignity of, right, like that's not the kind of God I believe in. Like, God does not do that kind of thing. Sickness is of the devil. Sickness is of evil. It's never something that God would use for his purposes. And I couldn't understand, like, what we are really actually right now reading right from the scripture here. The scripture is actually saying this here. So what is your theological explanation? And there was none. It was an emotional reaction. But I think both sides of that spectrum, people are bothered by.
Yes, good point. And would it be fair to say that obviously everyone has this verse to use, whatever position you have on God and evil, theodicy as a subject, everyone knows this verse is here. So it's not like we're surprising people and saying, aha, I got this verse to prove my point. But when Jesus says this, he's not, here's one option that we have to keep in mind. I think that when Jesus says this, he's not teaching as though it's a teacher to students, why is evil in the world? Mm-hmm. He's responding to a very clear situation and saying it's not what you think. Now, what it is, he may not be elaborating here when he says that the works of God may be revealed in him. Maybe he's not elaborating on the exact issue of why, but he's certainly elaborating on watch what I'm about to do. So he's going to emphasize the good that's going to come. And it's fair to say, I again, because I know both sides, or at least I've heard them quite, and Dr. Mike was on one of these more than I was, or one of these sides, as it were, too, that we don't have to posit or teach that God causes blindness in order to have his will known. That's not what the statement is saying. But Jesus is, in this context, stopping people short from saying it's because he sinned when he was a boy. We know that's not true. However, if you just give me a moment, you're going to see an amazing thing. So maybe we could emphasize that side of it. So, all right, let's keep moving. Thank you. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. He's going to use this situation for a very long story, and it's a fascinating one. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, then anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. This is one of those very rare times when Jesus performs a miracle with physical, manipulatives, as it were, and obviously it has caused some question. Why would packing mud on a man's eyes when you could just as well have cured him on the spot been done? Spittle was widely believed in the Greco-Roman world to possess healing, powers, and so maybe Jesus was just doing what was culturally expected of him at this moment, with, of course, a great miracle to follow that would change everything. The other options, and these are all in the may category. I'm not saying any of these are what the text is teaching. He may have been symbolically reenacting Genesis 2:7 when God took mud and made man. It's showing, the power of God's agent here doing the same work that his father does, something like that, maybe. This is probably part of it. He may have been purposely evoking a response from the Pharisaic enemies that were in front of him, because they felt that making clay, kneading mud and creating even clay, was classified as a work on the Sabbath. And that's, so maybe even as he was doing it, he was looking up, noticing the crowd of Pharisees watching him and encircling him slowly because he was disobeying Sabbath. Maybe that's part of it. He may have been doing one of these Old Testament prophet symbolic actions. Remember Ezekiel lying on his side for a certain amount of time and then tipping over, or Jeremiah breaking a pot. It wasn't unlike a prophet of that era to physically manipulate something to make a point. Maybe that's what he's up to. Again, this is one other commentator I read. He may have been exploiting the irony of making a blind man blinder, more blind with mud, only to reverse the entire story so that he becomes the best man of sight in the whole crowd. So something like that. I don't know. But it's interesting how, again, this story sticks out for its use of a moment of time where Jesus is placing mud on a man's eyes. So.
I mean, it does also seem to, because we know right after that, he tells him to go wash in the Pool of Siloam. And it's almost, here's a check. Will you actually follow through? Because you could just, why did you just put something on my face? I can't see. Seriously, did you just do this? And well, do you want to at least try it and just see what happens when you wash your face?
Yeah.
There's almost like that moment as well when he said to the lame man to get up, pick up your mat and walk, to a man who's been not able to walk for all his life. Right? And so it's almost essentially are you going to actually embody and actually live into what you hope that I had just done for you?
Yeah. And it gives him something to wash off, frankly.
Yeah.
So the next line, when he says, go wash in the Pool of Siloam, the man says, well, I'm glad to do it because, boy, you certainly made a mess of my face. So that's the next thing he says, go wash in the Pool of Siloam. By the way, this is one of those sites that we can, archaeologically pinpoint today. The city of David is on the southwest or southern area coming out of the Temple Mount area. And if you go another about half mile down from there, you come to what's been discovered in this century as the Pool of Siloam. It's about a half mile again. So this man was told to walk blind, or get help getting all the way down to the Pool of Siloam. It is downhill, at least that first trek. Today, it's been unearthed. It's a fascinating place to visit. It's being more and more excavated. It's turned. I just talked to someone who came back from a 2-week trip there, and he said the site they're discovering is much bigger than they thought. And the problem is, of course, that there are homes that are built here, so you can't just knock on someone's door and say, "Can I tear apart your living room? We have something under here we want to find." But the Pool of Siloam itself has been discovered, and the walk up, of course, back up to the temple. We don't have words of Jesus saying, "Come on back when you're done," but that's how the story goes. And I think that was just part of the understanding of the man. So that when we read, he went and washed and he came back, that's now I have in my mind's eye a man bounding up a half mile of stairs. I mean, it's uphill. When we take that trip back up to the temple, we usually offer our tour people a taxi, because it can be very tiring, especially if you're a little older. It's not an easy walk. And so that man bounded, I'm sure, up to the temple and stopped at a few places and told people about what happened. But that's what happens. He comes back to Jesus, seeing. Now, he doesn't know who Jesus is, obviously. That's part of the story, that this whole thing happens without him understanding who Jesus was. And so everything we read from here almost to the end of the chapter depends upon, well, here we go, Jesus putting mud on this man's eyes and not just immediately healing him. The neighbors and those who previously... go ahead, yeah.
So I'm trying to remember if I told you. So when I went to Israel almost 3 years ago, I actually had gotten a chance to actually visit that pool. Mm-hmm. And it was actually at the end of another place that we visited first, which was Hezekiah's tunnel.
Right.
And so what they actually allowed us to do was actually traverse the entire entrance from that site of the tunnel and actually walk through the tunnel with like headlamps and whatever else. The thing had water still running through it. Mm-hmm. And it was the strangest sensation of that, you're coming out from 95, 98 degree, dry, hot sun. And then the moment you go into that tunnel area, you got water just going right by your feet. And it's like the freshest and most soothing feeling. Mm-hmm. And then you're just walking. What essentially is just pure darkness ahead of you. And you have a lamp, and that's as far as you can see. And then eventually just opens up and you end up in this place that we later, the guides told us this is actually the pool. Yep. And so, we sat there for a while and we're just marveling at the fact that this is the end of that tunnel poured out into this area that was the pool.
Yeah. It's so cool in Israel how many places are being dug out still to this day, and the Antiquities Division of Israel itself just immediately shuts down everything around these places when they're discovered, because they are national parks. They turn them into national parks, and so they're very well taken care of by the Israeli government, and they're waiting for Americans and everyone else to come and see them. So I'm always glad to head over there. I think things have calmed down enough now that we can get back to Israel. That's my hope. Mm. Well, the neighbors and those who had previously seen the man who was blind said, "Is not this who sat and begged?" They recognized him. Some said, "Well, this is he." Others said, "Well, he's like him." Others said, and then finally he said, "I am he," ego eimi. Notice again that ego eimi is common language, and it sometimes is thought of when Jesus uses it as a referent to the divine name, but just realize a lot of people use it in normal conversation as well, just so we know. I am he. Therefore they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" You're a man of sight now. He said, "A man called Jesus." Now I'm going to stop there, because this is one of those things where you would pass right by this and not realize how this could be a DCW issue. But it really is. A man called Jesus, in Greek, ha anthropos, ha legomenos. Okay, and that legomenos is a simple present passive participle, masculine singular nominative in Greek, from the verb lego, very common, to say, to speak, to tell. Okay, it's a participle. When you go and it's translated as called, it's from the verb to say. So in the participle sense, as a passive participle, to be called something, you would use the word legomenos, all right? Mm-hmm. When you go over to 1 Corinthians 8:5, and it happens, I believe, one or two other places as well, but this is a good example where we can show even legomenos being used again. Legomenoi theoi is a phrase in 1 Corinthians 8:5. It's the same exact participle, although it's now plural, not singular. Present passive participle masculine plural nominative, again from Lego. Legomenoi theoi. Okay, it's plural because it modifies the Greek plural word theoi from theos. Of course, we know theos to be divine being, or translated often as God. Okay, the reason this is interesting to me is because if you look at most translations, and here's the ESV for an example, can you guess? If someone were to guess, well, the first time we had that word used, it's a man called Jesus. Okay, but because a lot of our versions don't believe in plural deities, created deities, or the gods of the Old Testament, for example, in the ESV, they put the word so-called in front of it. So a lot of people have heard this verse, 1 Corinthians 8:5. For although there be many so-called gods in heaven or on earth, indeed there are many gods, and it's put in quotations, and many lords. The ESV translator does not believe in other gods, so he's kind of stuck saying there are gods in heaven. Well, so he puts the word so in front of the word called, and in English, so-called means it's not really real, right? So I just find this a curious distinction in your translations that are willing to say, go ahead.
Yeah, the NIV does the same thing. I just looked it up.
So-called gods. And it's the same phrase as the called Jesus, a man called Jesus. So here's the point. Either you say a man so-called Jesus made clay, or you just say, no, a man called Jesus. And when you get to 1 Corinthians 8:5, you just say, no, beings called gods. That's what they're called. And I think Paul was trying to explain that very clearly to his Corinthian audience, that these beings are called gods, and that's not an apologetic or a sad thing to say about them. That's what they actually are. So look at your translations, everyone. 1 Corinthians 8:5, and see if they put the little word so in front of called. If so, it's a mistranslation.
Well,
go ahead.
If people are curious, the one translation I did just find that didn't do that, NET second edition.
Good. Well, NET, I generally trust it to be fair, textually fair. So
yeah,
good.
I didn't check Lexems yet, but yeah, it is a very interesting. It's a flourish. Yeah. It's a particular translation flourish. They're all
but I've heard it from the podium of a church numerous times. Well, they're so-called gods. They're not gods. Yeah. They're so-called. Well, they're adding a little word so in front of it that oh well.
It's actually technically not there.
Not there. Yeah. So he said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. And again, he doesn't know who he is. So all he knows is his name and maybe the sound of his voice, right? And anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and I received sight. Where is he? And he said, I don't know. They brought him who formerly was blind, never named in the story, to the Pharisees. Well, again, when the text says now it was Sabbath, it's hinting toward, we've got a problem. It was Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Baby Jesus did it purposely to annoy his enemies. Well, then the Pharisees also, this is verse 15, said or asked him again how he, the blind man, had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. Now, in Greek, para theou, there's no article there. So some could say it's possible to use the qualitative sense of theos there and say not divine. This man is not from the divine world or not appointed as a divine messenger or something like that. It doesn't have to have a capital G on it because, again, there's no article. So maybe it's emphasizing quality, not the person of God. But here's again what they say. This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner, referring to Jesus, do such signs? and there was a division among them. This is a good place to stop. I don't know if we've done it before. I look back in our conversation, Mike, and I don't think we've talked about this much. We probably did in Genesis, but the idea that when we have the word sinner in our New Testament text and Old, that it's not a Romans 3:23, all have sinned use of the term usually, because we have already in John, or we're coming up to in John later, these kind of phrases. John 9:24, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. 9:25, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. 9:31, we know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God, the opposite side. Looking back to the Old Testament, where we like to get our theology for the book of John, Psalm 1:1, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Psalm 1:5, therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Psalm 104:35, let sinners be consumed from the earth. You can tell by the use of it just in the Psalms, and this is, again, I'm just using this as a example of the rest of the Old Testament, that sinners is equated with as a synonym, really, for wicked or ungodly, or, frankly, out of fellowship with Yahweh, if not a non-member of the congregation of the righteous, like Psalm 1:5, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. You're either a sinner or you're in the congregation of the righteous. It's a category of existence. It's not, like in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned. It's not a word you just plaster across all of humanity, though you could say everyone sins. We know that. But the word sinner is used usually in the Bible for a classification of how you align with God's covenant people. Are you a sinner, or are you in the congregation of the righteous, to use the phrase of Psalm 1:5? It's, in fact, the opposite. Again, you can find this in like Proverbs 11:31. If the righteous is repaid on earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner? So it's opposed to the word righteous. And you can do this in Psalm 1:5, Proverbs 13:21. Disaster pursues the sinner, but the righteous are rewarded with good. So we need to be careful that when they're talking about Jesus being a sinner, the crowd, they're not saying he's a normal guy who sins a lot. No, they're saying he's on the wrong side of the story of God's family. He's outside the family. In fact, I would paraphrase it this way. How can a man who is a sinner, John 9:16, that is a man who is not righteous but is outside the covenant? That's what they mean by sinner here. And by the way, Romans 5, see, this is how it would work into a larger theology, that when we have Romans using the word sinner, which it does, as I've said in Romans 3:23, but how about Romans 5:8? God demonstrates his love toward us in that while we were still sinners, and I'd recommend that means people living outside Israel's covenant, Christ died for us. He's talking to the Gentile audience that's in Rome, who are outside the covenant because they're not Jews. They're uncircumcised. They don't follow Torah in any way. And yet they're finding through Paul's gospel that Jesus has died for them. So that's where I think this can really build into a theology, not just an interesting textual idea. But when we see the word sinner, I would recommend being careful with who are we talking about. So, well, any thoughts?
Ron, I think also this is, I think, where you and I may disagree about the audience or who's receiving this information, right? Because there are instances, for example, like in Acts 15, where Peter is talking about, like, he's making his case about why Gentile Christians should be considered part of the church and that they don't have to proselytize first. They don't have to become Jewish first, right? And he does use that phrase of, that there is no distinction between the Jew or the Gentile when he realized what happened with Cornelius. There was no difference. Right. There's no partiality that God has, and that we are all saved from our sins. And that's part of his dialogue in the Jerusalem Council. So I think we do have to be a little careful, because I think this word has a lot of semantic stretch by the time we get to the Second Temple period here. And I'm not disagreeing completely. I just think that we have to not always, I'm not sure we can just assume that the only folks, or the super majority of folks in the letter to the Romans was just Gentiles. I think there was a sizable Jewish population. If I remember some of the history going on in that New Testament period, some of the persecution that was happening with Christians was ironically because of a misidentification with Jews. And there is a little bit of that. You got Jewish Christians who are ethnically Jewish, but now they're following Jesus, mixing up with also Gentile Christians who are following Jesus. So what is going on here, kind of thing. And also the other thing I kind of have a pause is that when you're bringing up the Psalms, like we got poetry that's happening and the mentioning of the wicked and the sinner, that you got that A and B moment where you're actually emphasizing really just one clarifying idea that yes, these people are outside of the covenant, but ironically, the context is probably talking about not just non-Israelites. It's, like essentially people who are purposely doing evil things as well.
Well, yeah, certainly a man a person who is Jewish or an Israelite could be outside the covenant while living in the congregation of Israel if he is a purposeful sinner or, living wickedly within the covenant community. So, fair enough. I thought I'd throw that out there as a conversation piece, though, because it does. I guess what I'm reacting against is the idea that, this comes from a lot of reading of not just Second Temple stuff, but from Roman literature and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, or Stoic Epictetus. Did I say that right? Epictetus. I would hear different ways of pronouncing his name. These philosophers talked, and this goes well before Jesus, by the way, too. Sin is not a new idea. And sometimes we treat Romans 3:23 like Paul is inventing this doctrine of sin. He's introducing this idea that we've all sinned. And I think, haven't you read all the way back, hundreds of years before Christ, the idea that people sin is not new. And so I don't think Paul's inventing a doctrine of hamartiology in Romans 3 and trying to make that the basis for his soteriological message, because that's very well known to anyone that has been living on the face of the earth for thousands of years. We all sin, and we sin well. So that's why I'm pushing back a bit, saying, and we can let it go at this, but just be careful that when the word sinner is used in the Bible, take a look and see if there's a context within which we can say, here's what they mean by that. And clearly in John 9, when they say this man is a sinner, they're trying to categorize him as someone outside the covenant, on the wrong side of God, as opposed to a righteous man who still sins. But that's the point. A righteous man is not called a sinner in the Bible. He's called a righteous man who sins. And that's another discussion, but I'm just saying I think we need to be aware of that. So,
if anything, I think the part of the reason why there's an uneasiness I feel is because just even earlier at the beginning of this chapter, we were hearing the disciples ask the question, who sinned? Was it the man, or was it his parents? And it's almost like very close to, they would not have this language in their day, but it's essentially it's very close to this idea of, well, just because of your bloodline or because of who you are, of who you came from, that thus, well, obviously his parents did something, or he did something maybe in the womb, and that's why he was born blind. He's a sinner. That's why he's blind. And I'm just trying to be careful with that. The term sinner is not just going to be applied to the Gentile, right? That the Jew who may be religious, but still prideful, still hurtful, still uncaring. But just because I'm Jewish, I don't have to worry about it because I'm not born blind. I don't have any physical infirmities. That's what I mean. It's that there's a semantic range, and I think just maybe in these last couple of years, I'm just more sensitive to it. When I hear certain folks make insinuations that this person obviously can't be saved because they have such and such in their blood. And I think that's just something that I'm just more aware of in these last couple of years, because it's just been a strange couple of years.
Okay. I'm also thinking of Galatians 2:15, who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. So there again, you have that kind of a pigeonholing of what is a hamartolos. What is that person? He's not just a guy who sins. It's a person who's actually categorized as someone outside the covenant. So we'll let it go. But but I appreciate your pushback as always. Well, they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? He said, well, he's a prophet. Interesting choice of words. Notice he doesn't say he must be God or he must be a divine person. To them, a prophet had the ability, because of the agency that God granted. Think of, your Elijah and your Elishas and your Moses, that God can take a regular human being and give them the power of the miraculous because they are an agent of God for whatever reason. So that's where this man was theologically, that he was a human from what I can tell, but he had the power of God because he did this to me. So he thought he was a prophet. But the Jews did not believe until they called the parents of him who had received his sight, and they asked them, saying, is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? And again, remember, all this conversation happens because Jesus put mud on his eyes and sent him away. If he had healed him on the spot, you'd have none of this. They said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees, we do not know. We weren't here. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He's of age, ask him. He will speak for himself. So probably 30-ish and plus more. That's when they think of being of age. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. And here we go with a lot again of Second Temple Jewish thinking that is part of the story that you have to know to appreciate what's going on. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, Christos in Greek, he would be put out of the synagogue. What does removal from the synagogue mean? Let me just throw I've written out an idea here that, again, starts in Ezra 10. So this is part of our late Old Testament story that has had a trajectory of thinking up to the point of Jesus. Because if you go from Ezra 10 to John 9, you don't have a lot of Bible there because you have the end of the Old Testament and then, of course, John, one of the Gospels. In the world of Second Temple Judaism, exclusion from the religious community, they called it the synagogue after the exile to Babylon. That's where the synagogue idea got started. So notice it's never in your Bible. It functioned as a serious form of social, economic, and theological sanction. The Dead Sea Scrolls include this, but this is probably more than what Jesus was, or the story we have here in the temple, because Dead Sea Scrolls often include sectarian literature that may be far beyond at times, or at least beyond what the normal Jew experienced, okay? The Dead Sea Scrolls describe graded forms of expulsion that barred offenders from communal meals, ritual purity, and participation in the covenantal assembly. That's the key. To be kicked out of the synagogue, probably thus, and this is coming out of Ezra and Nehemiah, would mean loss of Israelite standing, often accompanied by severe economic penalties. And again, we get this out of Ezra 10, verse 8, and what it signifies for times to come in those people's expressions. So that's what being pushed out of the synagogue or kicked out, and this man will be thrust out coming up here, and I think it was more than just the left foot of fellowship, out the door. It must have been something even official. So why then also, we should ask this, why were they so against Jesus being the Messiah? And this isn't new to our conversation, but it's a good reminder that Messiah was not a private spiritual opinion. In other words, you just didn't walk around saying, I wonder if he is, I wonder if he is. Well, I think he is, I don't think he is. This is something where you would publicly, if you believed he was the Messiah, Jesus, you would make a stake in the ground and say, that is the man that God is working through. Well, when you say that, now you're confessing much more than just a private opinion. You are, well, let me read what I have. To confess Jesus as the Christ was to assert in that world that God had acted decisively through this man, and thus outside the recognized authorities of the temple, the scribes, the Pharisaic leaders that you had, the rabbis that surrounded you. In other words, you're making a huge statement when you say Jesus is the Christ, and you're judging between existing power structures with a man who has already said several times in John, your leadership are not even Yahwists. And so for you to align at this point with this man, this Jesus as the Messiah, it's a huge idea and a life-altering one. So the way we keep our religion private in America, I work a secular job now, and my team, we meet online every day. I don't know if they know I'm a Christian. I suppose they do. I mean, maybe in passing conversations with a couple of them off, kind of off hours time, I've told them things. But it's funny how we keep our religion private. That's just the American way. In that world, you did not. And so that's why confessing Jesus was not just one belief among many that you would have in banging around in your private head, but it was a way that you lived, and a way that you read Torah, and a way that you expressed your belief in Yahweh. And so that's why when they say, if you're going to confess Jesus as the Messiah, you're going to be kicked out of the synagogue, it would have been something that major to them. So,
and what's interesting is that even in modern day, and this is going back to the same trip I was on in Israel. Mm-hmm. We asked the Orthodox Jewish scholar, because she had mentioned there are agnostic Jews, Buddhist Jews, atheistic Jews, Hindu worshiping Jews, right, within Israel, and we asked her, well, what if a person who is born Jewish, ethnically Jewish, but then came to believe and trust that Jesus is the Messiah? And without batting an eye, she immediately said, that person is no longer Jewish.
No longer Jewish. I could have predicted what you were going to say. It's incredible how they can think that way. You can't be.
And she even said that even legally, in the state of Israel, your whole entire citizen status, you would lose your Jewish citizen status, and you would lose your ethnic status too. Crazy. And we were all of our jaws dropped because we couldn't understand. It's like, but you just said they're atheists, they're Buddhists, they're like, how? And part of her rationalization is like, well, there's been a long history of Buddhist Jews. There's been a long history of agnostic Jews, atheistic Jews. But that when it came down historically, once a person says that they are a follower of Jesus, a Christian, you're no longer Jewish.
It's still where they are.
And it just wasn't even a conversation after that.
They're very, very opposed to Friends of Israel and Jews for Jesus and groups like that try to mix Judaism and Christ profession. It's one thing to be a Christian and walk the streets of Israel. They don't mind that. But if you're going to be Jewish and Christian, again, Jews for Jesus kind of thing, that really offends the Orthodox Jew. So it's another conversation for another time, but it's interesting how that strange idea of if you believe in Christ or Jesus as Messiah, you're out. It's still here, still with us, and it's in John 9. Well, I'm in verse 24. They said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a hamartolos, a sinner. He answered and said, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that I was blind, now I see. What a beautiful testimony. I don't know my theology, he's admitting. I don't even know who healed me, frankly. I just know that I can see, and whoever did it, I want to thank. And now we're going to hear how they meet in a second, so let's just get there. They said, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I told you already. You didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciple? I think that was a tease that, they didn't want to go that direction. Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple. We are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. Pathen, often in Greek, from where the word means. Doesn't have a geographical or zip code meaning. It has more of a derivation of John 1:6, that John the Baptist was from heaven, sent from God. In other words, that idea of where you come from is not proving that you're a deity. It's that it's where you're getting your authority from. So this isn't an argue for deity. It's an argument for qualitative authority. We do not know where he is from. Okay. Why, this is a marvelous thing, this man then jokes with them, that you don't know where he is from, having opened my eyes. Now we know that God, here again comes that word sinners. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. I take that to mean outside the covenant. But if anyone is a worshiper of God inside the covenant and does his will, he hears him. So now that's good theology in one sense. I think it's very psalmistic, right? That God is against the evildoer / the wicked / the ungodly. The non-Yahwist is one that does not have the right to simply look up into the heavens and ask God for things. Whereas David would claim in the Psalms that if you have, if you are loyal to Yahweh, he is your shepherd, and you get to use to appreciate that covenant that you have with Yahweh, even in prayer. That's what he's arguing for here, that God does not hear sinners. We know that, but he does hear his own. He continues, verse 20 or 32. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. I think it is a very rare miracle because of its, you can't fake this, and blindness often is very permanent, and it just, once you get that disease that wastes away the eyes, I'm sure it was a very odd thing, if ever, to see someone who was blind healed. It's not like a bad back where you don't really know, but this is something that you can prove medically. If this man were not from God, again, that there's no article there, or not from the divine world, or having the quality of deity, he could do nothing. You were completely born in sins, they said now to him. They're going to say back to him, you were completely born in sins. Obviously, as a blind person, they thought that proved it. And you're teaching us, and they cast him out. So that casting out again, and recommended to be some kind of an official pushing away from communal access even to a synagogue, or just being part of the family of Abraham. Something very serious there. They cast him out. Now we hear of Jesus, and again, how much time passes as this whole story takes place? I'm sure at least an afternoon. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he, Jesus, had found him, the blind man, he said to him, and again, if you didn't know how to end this sentence, I think this would come as a surprise. If you could ask, or if Jesus could ask a man anything about his theology at this point in his ministry, what is he, 2 years in maybe to his ministry, and trying to explain to people his identity and what they need to believe to become a follower of his. It'd be interesting to pose that even to modern evangelicals. If you had, the elevator door is closing and you could yell one thing to someone before you lost sight of them, what would you yell? Do you believe what? And Jesus uses this phrase here. I think it's packed with meaning, and maybe there's, again, in John's recording of the story, he summarizes a much longer conversation into one phrase, but here it is. Do you believe in the Son of Man? The Son of Man. In Greek, it's exactly what it sounds like, the Son of Man. Nothing magical about that phrase. My guess is he's asking for a theological understanding that goes back to Daniel 7 and the idea that God has given in the coming days, if not now, the power or the agency of his delegated power to his Son, and that will be given to his Son so that every nation, every every land, every person in the world will bow to his Son. And I think that's all packed into that Son of Man phrase. Otherwise, it really makes no sense. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And I love his answer. He answered and said, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" I take it to mean, again, this is a summary of maybe a longer conversation, but it's basically, well, if I could find him, I would believe in him. There, that word pistos, pistuo, it must have a sense of more than just assent. It must have some kind of loyalty built in. Who is he, Lord, that I may pistis him, pistuo him? And Jesus said to him, you're looking at him. You have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Again, this whole story is built, the crisis moment of this moment, or the crisis moment here, is built upon all that has happened before, including sending him a mile away, or half a mile down and half a mile back. He said, Lord, I pistuo. And I take again that to mean I commit. And he worshipped him. Simple word for getting down on his face. He worshipped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see, or so they think, may be made blind. So there is the preaching that comes at the end of a beautiful miracle that was done again, not to prove that if a person can't see or is blind, that God must be doing it to them for some reason. Again, I don't know if we have to go that far, and there's a discussion for the apologists to go either way. I do believe that the Bible does, in general, push against what would have been Stoic philosophy of Peter and Jesus and the biblical era, that fate even ran the world of the gods. That was a very common idea, even for Josephus, that fate, capital F, they kind of personified fate to be a very powerful idea, and that even the gods had to be subject to fate in some way. If anything, the Jewish Bible argues against, it's that God himself is in control of everything, or sort of argues for that, and that the idea that I believe today, if you and I, Mike, are going through any kind of pain, the great difference between us and the Stoic atheist of Paul's day or Jesus' day, who could look into the heavens and say, well, I guess it's just fate. The difference is we have a God who claims to not only create the world, but run the world. And we always can go to him in supplication and knowing that he has a plan, even if it's, again, we get into that conversation of his doing something that's evil, shall we say, or allowing it. I think all of that is English words to kind of soften the conversation down to where we don't want to blame God for evil. But in the long run, God does put a stamp of authority on everything that happens in the world, and to some degree, he is accountable on that level. So, yeah, many bad things have happened to you and happened to me, and we have to all work through that.
Well, and I think that's part of why, this goes into the study of the book of Job for me in the past, of how, Job wanted to ask God all these questions. Why did all this happen to him? And ultimately, God's answers essentially is that he is the one that, the buck ends with him. And so, but he isn't afraid of Job's questions. Yes, come at me with them. Talk with me about them. Yell at me if you have to, because in the end, he's the one that authorized everything. And so the issues really do need to be brought up before him, but that's actually part of what it means to be in relationship with him, is Absolutely. To actually have that conversation. Ron, one thing I did want to mention, and I don't know if you picked up on it too. The blind man went, we were just talking earlier at the beginning of this about, for you were noticing the theme of just revealing and revelation. For this blind man, when they first ask him after his healing, who did this to you? And he just simply says, it's a man called Jesus. So he's just a guy. It's just a man. And then when he starts getting questioned by the Pharisees, he then says, well, he's a prophet. So you go from just being a simple man to now you're saying he's a prophet. And then finally to this moment when Jesus is actually talking with him, do you want to meet the Son of Man, which we know is a much higher title?
Mm-hmm.
That it's like, yes, absolutely. I want to pledge my allegiance to this guy.
Yeah. And so that's why I think this conversation lasted much longer than 4 or 5 verses in Greek.
Yeah,
sure
but it is just hilarious of like his understanding slowly the arc carried to this moment where he went from a man to prophet and now to, yes, I'm looking for the Son of Man.
Yeah. Cool. We got 2 more verses and we're done. Some of the Pharisees heard these words and said to him, "Are we blind also?" Oh, it's what a setup, right? Jesus said to them, of course, they're asking with the sense of, you're not saying we're blind. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains." And I take that to be more than just Adamic guilt. This is a sin of disloyalty again. This is why Israel's in exile. Because we have leadership in Israel saying, we see. And Jesus is saying, the sin of exile is still yours to bear. Because you have turned away from Yahweh to the point that you can't see anything, metaphorically speaking. So, good example, again, I think that we're not talking about Adamic guilt here. We're talking the reason that Israel is where they are. So, well, anything else to wrap up chapter 9? I always feel bad that I only spend an hour on a beautiful chapter like this, but that's the way we do this here on the podcast. We can't talk about everything, but wonderful chapter, and it's only in John. So,
if anything, I would just say it did bring back some flashbacks for me from George Atlas's book, Bridging the Testaments, especially just the whole entire resistance to the concept of Messiah, right? Because by this point, the whole entire temple system, the priesthood, the priests are the ones who are in power. And if you have a Messiah, if you have a descendant of David who's supposed to be on the throne, well, then technically the way it should be, how it should work, is that the priests actually work for this king, work for this Messiah. And so thus we really don't want a Messiah around, because that means we would no longer be the ones in power, calling the shots, making the decisions for people. So it just brought back all those memories. And it goes back to just even that sermon I was preaching on yesterday, that Joseph's family went from being kings of Israel to then him, by the time we get to where he shows up in the story, and he's a stonemason. And just simply how the family of David is now in this destitution. And why? It's like they're supposed to be this honored family, but they're not by the time we get to Jesus's day. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. One thing we can say with this man, give God the glory. This one thing I know, that I was blind and now I see. All because of Jesus. So, all right. Thank you, Mike. We'll talk again next time. And again, Merry Christmas to those of you who are, we're coming just after the Christmas season. And I trust you had a wonderful time with friends and family and could worship not, again, just a rescue mission Jesus, but a revelatory Jesus who is there because the Father wants to show the world his loved one. We'll talk to you again next time. Thank you so much.